Hello YouTube. In this video we're going to talk about dialetheism. Dialetheism is the view that there are true contradictions. There are some propositions that are both true and false. Dialetheism is a minority position, but over the last few decades it has become increasingly influential. Now, if we claim that there are true contradictions, then this raises the question of, well, how prevalent are they? How common are they? I mean, first of all, why does this matter? Well, a common view is that contradiction has an important role to play in inquiry. So normally, if we discover that a theory entails a contradiction, we conclude that the theory cannot be true. So contradiction tells us when a theory ought to be discarded. So we discover that there's some, that a theory entails a contradiction. What that means is, well, we throw it out. We're like, nope, that theory can't be right. It must be false. Consistency is an epistemic virtue, and giving this up would involve pretty radically changing the nature of inquiry. Now, epistemic virtues do not have to be perfectly truth-conducive. So take, for instance, simplicity, which tells us not to multiply entities beyond necessity. Other things being equal, the simpler theory is more likely to be true. But simplicity does not guarantee truth. It's just an indicator for truth. So if you have a theory that seems hopelessly complex, well, that gives you some reason to discard the theory. But it might well turn out, there might be other considerations that weigh so heavily in favour of the hopelessly complex theory that you end up accepting it. So a dialetheist might well say the same thing about consistency and contradiction. There are true contradictions. So, the mere fact that a theory entails a contradiction, that's not going to guarantee that the theory is false. But it's still going to be a kind of imperfect indicator that the theory is false. Generally speaking, when a theory is inconsistent, that theory is going to be false. Generally speaking, the true theories are consistent. True contradictions are very rare. So contradiction can still play its usual role in inquiry. By showing that a theory is contradictory, this strongly indicates that it's false. So that means that it requires very extraordinary considerations in favour of the theory before we will accept it. But of course, saying all of this requires that contradictions are rare. So unless the dialetheist wants to radically reform how inquiry works, we're going to need to say that contradictions are rare. So along similar lines, a standard pattern of inference is disjunctive syllogism. P or Q, not P, therefore Q. For instance, Verity is at the beach or Verity is at the cinema. Verity is not at the beach, so Verity is at the cinema. Traditionally, disjunctive syllogism has been viewed as a logical law. The truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Now suppose that there are true contradictions. In that case, disjunctive syllogism leads to explosion. So we assert the contradiction, P and not P. From this we can derive P. From P we can derive P or Q. But since we have P and not P, we can derive not P. And then, of course, P or Q, not P, therefore Q. So from a contradiction, anything follows, right? If you assert a contradiction, then you can derive absolutely anything that you like. I have a video on the principle of explosion which explains this in much more detail, so you can check that out if you want. Now, the standard response among dialetheists is to deny that disjunctive syllogism is logically valid. When we're in domains where there are true contradictions, it may well be that the premises of a disjunctive syllogism are true while the conclusion is false. But few dialetheists are prepared to abandon disjunctive syllogism entirely. They want to say that disjunctive syllogism is a useful rule of inference which is reliable across a wide range of domains. Why is it reliable? Well, I mean, people who deny dialetheism have a straightforward answer. We can say, look, disjunctive syllogism is valid provided the premises are not contradictory, and necessarily there are no true contradictions. That answer isn't available to dialetheists. But dialetheists can say something like this. Disjunctive syllogism is reliable because contradictions are rare, right? Disjunctive syllogism is valid provided the premises are not contradictory, and it's just very rare that we're ever going to encounter a contradiction. Most domains are consistent. And in a consistent domain, disjunctive syllogism will lead from true premises to true conclusions. It's not going to take you from truth to falsity. So this is why we need to consider the prevalence of true contradictions. Most dialetheists are, I suppose, fairly conservative when it comes to methodology and reasoning. They want to preserve consistency as an epistemic virtue. They want to maintain the quasi-validity of disjunctive syllogism. So they need to show that contradictions are improbable. But what's the justification for this? Why should we assign a low probability to contradictions? I think, first of all, it might be worth noting that one thing that we're probably not going to want to say, that there are few contradictions. If there is one true contradiction, there are infinite true contradictions. So let's say that P is both true and false. So we're going to say that P and not P, the conjunction P and not P, is true. But it will also be the case that, so if we say that P and not P is true, because obviously P is true and not P is true, well, it's also going to be the case that P and not P is false. Because, since not P is true, P is false, and since P is true, not P is false. So both P and not P are false. And if any conjunct in a conjunction is false, the conjunction as a whole is false. So the conjunction P and not P is both true and false. So in other words, if you start by saying that P is both true and false, you can derive that the conjunction P and not P is both true and false. But then it's going to follow from that if we say not P and not P, that's both true and false as well. And from that, it will follow that not P and not P is both true and false. And so on, no matter how many negations we add. So from one true contradiction, if we have a proposition that's both true and false, from that one true contradiction, we can get an infinite number of true contradictions. Obviously in this sort of example, we can see that this infinite sequence of contradictions is in some sense dependent on the initial contradiction. If you were to remove the fact that P is contradictory, a true contradiction, then you remove all of the other contradictions that follow. Maybe a better way to think about this is to consider something like prime numbers. There are an infinite number of primes, just as there's an infinite number of whole numbers, where the whole numbers include both primes and non-primes. So the set of primes and the set of whole numbers are the same size, they're both infinite. But primes are statistically rare, in the sense that if you select a random number from all the whole numbers, it's almost certainly not going to be prime. And this is because prime numbers become less common as they become larger. So, maybe the dialetheists might say, well, yeah, there's an infinite number of true contradictions, but these are sort of statistically rare relative to true propositions in general. True contradictions occur only in specific contexts that we're unlikely to encounter in everyday life. Okay, well, just a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon, where I have a bunch of bonus videos. So if you want to hear more of me, then you can sign up to that. I also have a PayPal if you want to just throw me some cash. Obviously, all of that is very much appreciated. And with that said, we will move on. Okay, so why should we think that true contradictions are rare? Graham Priest has given 3 arguments for the improbability of true contradictions. There's a nice short paper by J.C. Beall where he responds to a couple of Priest's arguments called Dialetheism and the Probability of Contradiction. So we'll look at Priest's arguments, we'll consider some of the responses. Okay then, let's start with Priest's first argument. So the first argument rests on the following premise. Premise 1. If X is a true contradiction, then X is a proposition that is self-referential, or logico-mathematical, or is about legal or dialectical situations, or is about states of affairs that are instantaneous. So the basic idea here is that we just list all of the situations in which true contradictions occur. And once we have that list, we're going to have a necessary condition on true contradictions. So if we have a list of all the propositions in domains where there are true contradictions, then obviously we're going to have a list of all of the true contradictions. So what we're doing is we're just looking at, okay, what types of propositions, so like when we have true contradictions, what types of propositions are they? And then we just list those types. So this premise 1 states a necessary condition on true contradiction. Next, we claim that the frequency with which we encounter propositions that satisfy the necessary condition stated in premise 1 is low. So when we think about the propositions that we examine during ordinary inquiry, it's very rare that we deal with propositions in these domains. So the frequency with which we encounter true contradictions is low. And so for any given proposition we're considering, there's a low probability that it's a true contradiction, because there's a low probability. So for any proposition we're considering, there's a low probability that it satisfies the necessary conditions stated in premise 1. So yeah, that's the argument. Now, one immediate concern about this argument is that the types of propositions listed in premise 1 do not seem to share any underlying property. I mean, we have self-referential propositions, we have propositions about legal institutions, we have propositions about instantaneous states of affairs. This is a very ragtag bunch. It's nothing obvious unites them other than the fact that these are apparently contradictory, or at least there can be true contradictions in these domains. So, I mean, this condition that's stated in premise 1, it doesn't in any obvious way allow us to identify some more basic property that makes true contradiction possible. No underlying property in virtue of which true contradiction becomes possible. But in that case, we might worry, well, how can we be sure that we've successfully listed all of the domains in which true contradictions arise? I mean, it looks like the only way to determine which classes of propositions get listed in premise 1 is just to appeal directly to the arguments for dialetheism. Graham Priest, well, he's obviously argued that some self-referential propositions concerning logic, legal institutions, instantaneous states of affairs are true contradictions, but the arguments for dialetheism in different domains have only expanded over time. Priest himself has, over time, argued for true contradictions in an ever wider range of domains. Beyond Graham Priest, other people have argued that true contradictions arise in the context of social institutions more generally, not just legal situations, but just almost any kind of social institution might instantiate a true contradiction. So I have a video on social contradictions where I talk about this. In morality, again, I have a video on moral contradictions, and in empirical science, again, I have a video on inconsistency in science. So, we're starting to expand the list in premise 1 quite considerably here. Now, one obvious strategy that Priest could use is to say, well, whenever true contradictions are discovered in some new domain, we just add that domain to our list in premise 1. And the expanded list will give us the necessary condition. The risk with this strategy is that as that list inflates over time, I mean, first of all, it becomes increasingly ad hoc. I mean, as we noted, it's already pretty ad hoc. There's no obvious underlying property. It's already kind of a ragtag bunch. The more stuff we add to it, though, the more ad hoc it's going to look. But, I mean, more worryingly, as the list inflates, we might end up adding enough different things that the types of propositions on the list actually are likely to be encountered very regularly in ordinary inquiry. So there are already examples of this. One context in which some people have applied dialetheism is to deal with borderline cases of vague predicates. Many terms in language are vague, in that the term has borderline cases of application. So consider the term red. We can take a colour spectrum where we have a colour that is determinately red on one end and a colour that is determinately not red on the other, because it's determinately blue, say. But there's no precise cutoff point where we transition from, like, yes, this is clearly red, to yes, this is clearly not red. In fact, if a transition is gradual enough, the differences between the adjacent color patches might be imperceptible. So there's going to be a sequence of color patches, somewhere in the middle, where it's just totally indeterminate whether they're red, and you're not even, and like the shift from one color patch to another, you just won't even be able to perceptually detect it. Imagine if you were to take that spectrum that I've got there and then just extend it for, a mile, right? And then you just look at each inch of the spectrum. You're not going to see any difference between two different slices that are an inch long. So my point is yeah, I mean, like, this is a case where it's indeterminate, or it seems to be just indeterminate. There's no precise cutoff. Now, a standard treatment of vagueness is supervaluationism, where the idea is that when we have a borderline case of a predicate, we have a truth value gap. The borderline case satisfies neither the predicate nor its negation. So for our borderline color patches, the proposition "this patch is red" is neither true nor false. But recently, some dialetheists have suggested that borderline cases are truth value gluts. Borderline cases satisfy both the predicate and its negation. It's both true and false to say that the colour patch is red. Now, this treatment of vagueness is very controversial, but I mean, so is every other treatment of vagueness. The point is, this is an argument for dialetheism that a lot of people take seriously. Now, vagueness is pervasive. Vagueness is everywhere. If we accept the dialetheic account of vagueness, contradiction will be spread throughout the empirical world. Indeed, you can directly observe contradictions. When you look at that colour field that I showed on the screen, you just see directly a contradictory colour. You see a colour that is both red and not red. And notice that the borderline cases are themselves vague, just as there is no precise step from red to not red. There is no precise step from determinately red to borderline case of red. So, from once you introduce this idea, it seems like almost every observation we ever make will be contradictory in one way or another. Because a color that, if you take a color that's determinately red, that's going to be a vague instance of something else. A determinately red color patch will perhaps be it might be a borderline case of some specific shade of red. It might be a borderline case of cherry red, right? So if the dialethic account of vagueness is right, contradictions, I mean, they're mundane, they're just everywhere. So it certainly isn't going to help Priest's argument to add propositions involving vague predicates to his list in premise 1, because we deal with those propositions all the time. Okay, Priest's second argument. So this is the head count argument. Priest puts it this way. The simplest argument for the low frequency of true contradictions is a head count. The reader is invited to consider a random sample of the assertions he has met in the last few days and see what percentage might reasonably be thought to be dialetheic. Now, this may be intended as a restatement of the first argument rather than a separate argument, but one way to interpret this head count argument is that rather than listing the domains in which true contradictions occur and then taking this as a necessary condition on true contradiction, well, we just count up how frequently we actually encounter true contradictions in ordinary life and ordinary inquiry. That doesn't require making any assumptions about what's necessary for true contradictions. But Priest is going to say that what we find is, well, we just basically never or hardly ever encounter contradictions. Now, of course, this argument, I think, falls prey to the same problem as the previous argument. Once we open up the doors to dialetheism, there are a variety of ordinary statements that can reasonably be argued to be dialetheic. If propositions containing vague predicates are dialetheic, then contradictions are all over the place. A great many of our ordinary claims about the world are going to be contradictory. Now, of course, most people who do this head count of true contradictions they're not going to say that there are any, but most people who have thought about this topic deny that true contradictions are even possible. Dialetheism is a minority position among philosophers. The question here is for those who endorse dialetheism. there are philosophers who are intelligent and well informed about the relevant arguments who have presented arguments that entail that many ordinary claims are dialetheic. So, it's not obvious that we can just sort of dismiss that. A second difficulty with the head count argument is that it seems to be highly dependent on what a person's interests happen to be. Priest himself admits that if you've been reading a book about dialetheism, then you might well have encountered a large number of true contradictions. So if the reason why we rarely encounter true contradictions is that we're just, not interested in them, we're not interested in the domains in which true contradictions tend to arise, then I'm not sure if that really tells us much about the prevalence of true contradictions. Maybe that just tells us something about what we happen to be interested in. So it's not clear that that helps to establish consistency as some sort of general epistemic virtue or the general reliability of disjunctive syllogism. If there are contexts where contradictions are common, then in those contexts it looks like it would be irrational to favour consistent theories. It would be irrational to use disjunctive syllogism. Let's turn to Priest's third argument. So the argument is essentially this. Priest says that in the vast majority of our inquiries, disjunctive syllogism does not fail. So in the vast majority of cases where P or Q is true and not P is true, Q will also be true. And it will be reasonable for people to infer from P or Q and not P to the conclusion Q. But if disjunctive syllogism does not fail in some domain, then that domain must be consistent. Suppose that P is a true contradiction, then P is true and not P is also true. Well, then the premise P or Q is made true by P, while the premise not P, well, that's also true because not P is true. But then it may still be that the conclusion Q is false. So, where we have true contradictions, we can be led from true premises to a false conclusion. And as we've seen, true contradictions, disjunctive syllogism leads to explosion. So dialetheists are going to want to say that disjunctive syllogism is not valid, strictly speaking. Now, dialetheists need to explain the utility of disjunctive syllogism. Why does disjunctive syllogism appear to be valid? This is a problem for dialetheism, right? Like, why is it that we use disjunctive syllogism successfully in such a wide range of domains? There's a kind of, there's like a puzzle here, an explanatory puzzle. But this very explanatory burden can then be used to argue that true contradictions are improbable. Disjunctive syllogism would not be useful if true contradictions were common, so true contradictions are rare. Disjunctive syllogism appears to be valid because in most of its instances, true premises do lead to a true conclusion, and that's because most cases are consistent. So this is the idea, right, is that we start out by noticing the reliability of disjunctive syllogism, and we argue from that to the conclusion that true contradictions are improbable. So J.C. Beale responds that as an argument for the rarity of true contradictions, the appeal to disjunctive syllogism is circular. What needs to be shown is that disjunctive syllogism preserves truth in most ordinary situations. But what grounds are there for believing that? Well, Beale worries that any justification we give here will appeal to the low probability that we will encounter a true contradiction. So that is, we're only going to believe that disjunctive syllogism does not fail in some domain if we presuppose that there are no true contradictions in that domain, or if we presuppose that contradictions are very rare in that domain. But that's exactly what we're supposed to prove. So Beale says that the dialectic is sort of working like this, right? We have this question: why do you think that true contradictions are rare? And the dialetheist says, well, it's because disjunctive syllogism is truth preserving in most situations. But then we have the question, well, why do you think that disjunctive syllogism is truth-preserving in most situations? And the answer is, because true contradictions are rare. Here's another way to put this. Suppose we suspend judgment about the frequency of true contradictions. We're interested in investigating how prevalent true contradictions are. Well, in that case, surely we should also suspend judgment about the reliability of disjunctive syllogism. once contradictions are admitted, disjunctive syllogism is thrown into question. At least I think that's the idea. Now, I'm not sure that Beale's objection here is so convincing. As I see it, Priest's point is about the utility of disjunctive syllogism. We don't have to presuppose that disjunctive syllogism is truth-preserving in most situations. Rather, the idea is, well, this is just what we find in practice. So, like, we just, look at the, various cases where people have made these arguments, and what we find is that when we have an argument that instantiates disjunctive syllogism and which has premises that we accept, we are then led to a plausible conclusion, a conclusion that's independently verified. So basically, like, I accept these premises, I see that these premises instantiate disjunctive syllogism, then I see that there's a conclusion that I also think is true. I find this over and over and over again. By contrast, there are very few cases where there are premises that I accept which lead me to a conclusion that I think is false. This needs to be explained. This is puzzling. This is a puzzling phenomenon that needs to be explained. And the explanation is, well, contradictions are rare. So you don't need to make the assumption that contradictions are rare. In a way, this is kind of analogous to Priest's headcount argument, but where what we're counting up are cases where disjunctive syllogism fails. With that said, I think there might be perhaps a better way to make the point that Beale is trying to get at, which is, we're trying to show that disjunctive syllogism is reliable in most situations. So, we do this thing where we sort of list all of the cases of disjunctive syllogism. We take the cases where the premises are true, of course, and we're sort of looking for a case where the premises are true, but where they lead to a false conclusion. So when we find this, right, let's say somebody presents us with an instance of disjunctive syllogism with true premises and a false conclusion. Is this a counterexample to disjunctive syllogism? Does this count as a failure of disjunctive syllogism? Well, not necessarily, because you could just respond to this by saying, well, actually, no, one of those premises is false. Or actually, no, the conclusion is true. Indeed, that's how we normally respond, right? When we see an instance of disjunctive syllogism that appears to have true premises and it appears to have a false conclusion, what we say is, oh no, the appearances here are deceptive. Actually, we were wrong. Like, it must be that one of the premises is false or the conclusion is true. That's just what it is for disjunctive syllogism to be a norm of inquiry. We don't take it that disjunctive syllogism has failed. We take it that our initial judgment that the premises are true and the conclusion false, that judgment was mistaken. So what that means is that when we perform the sort of head count of disjunctive syllogism arguments, the reason why we find so few cases of failure, perhaps no cases at all, well, that might just be because we've assumed from the outset that disjunctive syllogism is reliable. Of course it will appear that disjunctive syllogism never fails if, in response to a case where the premises are apparently true and the conclusion is apparently false, our inclination is to adjust our beliefs about the premises or about the conclusion. But that inclination just expresses our assumption of the reliability of disjunctive syllogism, which is what we need to establish. By analogy, suppose that there's a community where it's a norm in that community never to hold beliefs that are inconsistent with the Bible. Whenever an argument is proposed where the premises are apparently true and the conclusion is apparently inconsistent with the Bible, the norm is to adjust that assumption about the appearances. So the norm is to say, well, actually, it must be that one of the premises is false, or it must be that the conclusion has not been interpreted correctly. So now suppose that a member of this community tries to show that the Bible is reliable by doing this sort of head count. They try to count up the instances of beliefs held by the community, and they sort them into the beliefs that are consistent with the Bible and the beliefs that are inconsistent with the Bible. Well, obviously, they're not going to find many, if any, beliefs of the second sort, but that's not really a very convincing case that the Bible is reliable. And so that's where we are with disjunctive syllogism, or that's the worry. Here's a slightly different objection to Priest's third argument. So again, let's say we try to show that disjunctive syllogism is reliable by examining instances of this argument form. The problem, of course, is that you should notice no one's ever actually done that. Nobody's ever tried to make a sort of representative list of disjunctive syllogism arguments, where the premises are true, and then see whether the conclusion is also true. And is it really so obvious that disjunctive syllogism is going to turn out to be reliable in practice? I mean, is it even obvious that we actually use disjunctive syllogism in practice? So, I mean, how often do we use disjunctive syllogism? Well, one thing to keep in mind here is that in philosophy and logic texts, the examples that we give of this they're toy arguments. They are simplified, idealized pieces of reasoning that are actually quite unlike the patterns of reasoning that we're going to find in ordinary inquiry. So earlier I gave this example. Verity is at the beach, or Verity is at the cinema. Verity is not at the beach, so Verity is at the cinema. That's a very strange piece of reasoning. That's a very odd... I mean, I think it's just worth kind of really thinking about, like, how often do you actually see people reasoning in that kind of way? I mean, how often do you find that? I'm just saying there's something odd about that. I mean, here's another example. I just took this from Wikipedia. I will choose soup or I will choose salad. I will not choose soup, therefore I will choose salad. Again, very strange. These arguments clearly instantiate the form of disjunctive syllogism, but they're sort of simple, toy arguments that it would be very bizarre to find in any normal situation. So notice that, I mean, let's take the first one, right? If I were to assert that Verity is at the beach or Verity is at the cinema, like if I were to say that in most ordinary circumstances, that's probably because I'm going to be unsure, right? Like when I say, Verity is at the beach or Verity is at the cinema, if someone says to me like, hey, where's Verity? And I'm like, well, Verity's at the beach or she's at the cinema. What I'm communicating there is I'm not really sure which one she's at. She might be at the beach or she might be at the cinema for all I know. That's what that statement would normally indicate. But then in that case, I'm certainly not going to assert the second premise that Verity is not at the beach. If I know that Verity is not at the beach, it would be very strange to think to myself, Verity is at the beach or Verity is at the cinema. So, I mean, from that point alone, you can see there's something a bit odd about this. And of course, with the case of, choosing soup or choosing salad, I don't think any of us ever make our decisions in that kind of way. So, I mean, no doubt there are plenty of examples of more realistic reasoning where we might reconstruct the reasoning as being an instance of disjunctive syllogism. But the proper interpretation of any natural language reasoning is going to be a controversial matter. So it's not just obvious that we regularly use disjunctive syllogism when we reason. And it's not something... the idea is maybe that's something that we shouldn't just be taking for granted here. But if that's right, then it's not clear that disjunctive syllogism is, in fact, a norm of reasoning, and it's not clear that abandoning disjunctive syllogism would involve making the sorts of radical changes to ordinary inquiry that were the concern here. If we think that there are true contradictions, so that disjunctive syllogism is logically invalid, then that might be taken as further reason to doubt that disjunctive syllogism is regularly employed in practice. And then, of course, we can't appeal to the everyday reliability of disjunctive syllogism in arguing for the low probability of encountering true contradictions. So, yeah, I mean, that's the worry. Okay, well, that's that for that video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.